Today we're going to be looking at improving performance in the Lord of the Rings Online and potentially boosting your FPS. So on the launcher here, I've already logged into my account. You don't necessarily have to do that first, but thought I would start off with some basic things. And in the options with the launcher, in the general tab, you can go to the 64-bit client if that is not already selected. I made a video on this when it was actually launched. It had some surprising improvements to performance that I did not really expect, such as just a few higher frames per second and a lot more consistent performance was one of the big things there. So if you're not on the 64-bit client, I would recommend that. I also, while we're here, do want to highlight in the general tab as well, the use high resolution game data. If you're interested in higher resolution game data and you do not have that checked, it will require a little bit more to download and install though. That is pretty much it in the launcher. Of course, you can go through the other settings as you wish, but let's go ahead and log in game here and check some of those settings out. So one thing I do want to point out is my PC is a lot better than some of the old PCs that I'd run this game on. Right now I have, for the important stuff, I am on an SSD and I have RTX 3070 Ti for GPU and i9-11900K Intel CPU. So with that in mind, on older hardware, you might see more performance improvements than I see, such as when I was with my older CPU and especially the old AMD one and GTX 970 GPU. So with that out of the way, something that I actually like to keep high to start is texturing. I have noticed that that typically doesn't impact performance too much. So basically on any system that I've run this game on, I always have that really high and try to limit other things. Usually not with like object material details, but lighting, shadows, and not necessarily particle effects. That was not an option back in the day, so you might see some performance improvements there, but with post-processing. So these three sections are where I would suggest starting to drop some settings and quality to see performance improvements and keep other things high, but of course some of that's subjective depending what you like as far as your visual quality goes. So in game, I'm looking towards the Mist Hollow from Anak Curfew, and this is just a not very performant area. Even with my hardware, I have FPS in the 40s. This would be a great place to showcase some settings you might be able to change, and for this particular instance, improve performance. Like if I turn off post-processing, my FPS does go up by quite a bit staring at the same area, just to give an example of how this can improve your performance. In this particular case, don't notice too much difference turning on and off high quality lighting. I do notice a visual difference though, so that does come into play. Then I could go through the same with all the shadow settings, but that's probably not too exciting. This is again pretty basic stuff to start off. Now, a couple things to highlight in the bottom is texture cache size. I have been messing with my settings a little bit for this video, but I usually turn that all the way up because my personal system, I do have a lot of resources, including memory, so I am fine turning that up. And then finally with player crowd quality, I usually just turn that down for crowded areas to improve quality. I go all the way to 0 personally. But the final setting I want to highlight is in the regular graphics tab, and that is going to be anti-aliasing. On old hardware, especially my old GPU, the GTX 970, I would actually run into issues with the 8x anti-aliasing, and it would even cause very low performance like single-digit FPS in particular cases. So to avoid that, I would go to 2x. Now on this system, I go to 8x and there's no real difference in performance. Once things finally get loaded, we can see my FPS is basically the same between 2x and 8x. If I do disable it all the way, it still looks pretty similar. And the main benefit with anti-aliasing, if I zoom back out, if we look at perhaps my character's ears, you can notice the corners are a little bit more rounded and less harsh when I have anti-aliasing up. So while we are looking in game here, one other thing I do want to highlight before I get to my big tip for this video is going to be Sweet FX and Reshade. This is a program that some people use to improve the visual quality, or at least the fidelity of the game, the appearance of that without actually modifying the graphics. And with this, it does cost performance. So it's something, if you are using that, do consider that it costs performance. Now, how much your FPS will drop because of this depends on your situation. For me, on older hardware, I actually took a really big performance hit. I know my previous PC was a few FPS, single digits, maybe to even around around 10 to 15 or so. And on this one, I haven't actually tested it because I personally don't use reshade in SweetFX, but it's something to consider that I know people do, so thought I would mention that. So now that we've gone through some basic things with actual in-game settings, let's start looking at some external things that you can change to perhaps improve performance. So if you are like me, then you might have a whole lot of programs running and some of them eating CPU, such as Google Chrome here. If we look at performance, I'm nowhere near like fully utilizing everything, even my GPU. That is pretty much always the case with LOTRO, but if I go into the details page, you can see there's a whole lot of stuff running, and if I sort it by CPU usage, LOTRO, Chrome, and OBS are always near the top. So sometimes I will have something eating up CPU resources, and to improve performance in the game, sometimes by quite a bit, I set the CPU priority to higher in the task manager here. So just right click it, then go to that, and I can change priority to real time. Also, I can verify that I'm running LOTRO client 64.exe instead of just LOTRO client.exe, so I am using 64-bit. If I look at the exact same area I'm at though, the FPS is pretty much the same, maybe actually 1 or 2 higher, but that could be slightly changed camera angle or something, ignoring that I disconnected from the game, it looks like. So this is something that will not always help, but I have noticed in a few instances, especially depending what else I have running on my computer, I can actually get a few FPS boost, and I think the biggest thing is more consistency in my performance by changing that. It is something I have heard from other people that have tried it. They can also get a few FPS as well. So while my example right here is not necessarily perfect, it is something that I would really suggest you trying to improve your performance. So the final thing I want to highlight will actually vary quite a bit depending on your system. Now, I have personally only used either Intel integrated GPUs or NVIDIA GPUs if I have a dedicated graphics card. And on this particular computer, again, I have NVIDIA, so this might differ if you are using Intel or AMD, especially AMD if you have a dedicated GPU. But the whole point of it is to make sure that LOTRO is actually running on your dedicated graphics card, your better GPU if you have multiple GPUs. So in the program settings here, this is just for NVIDIA, for example, manage 3D settings. So the main thing is to make sure it's actually using your GPU. So you can specify which GPU here. And for me, not having an integrated graphics at all on this desktop, it might look a little bit different, but did just want to point out, make sure you are actually running it on your dedicated graphics card. It's something I know people have run into issues with. And then basically, any scenario running it on dedicated graphics card would be much better than integrated GPU. Now, in the past, I have done a lot of tinkering with all these other settings that you can actually change directly in the NVIDIA control panel, but I have never noticed any differences by changing this stuff. Perhaps it varies by program, but did just want to point that out while we were here. And as far as this video goes, I know it was a little bit short, but I do hope that can help some people improve their performance and actually increase their FPS in LOTRO. Please let me know in the comments if any of this helped and maybe which tip was most helpful. And if you did enjoy this video or learned something useful, please consider liking and subscribing for more or becoming a channel member to support the content. And thanks for watching, everyone.